Now, I have to explain that this video, when first set to me, I thought, that's definitely going to make a premiere, because that's a topic and a half, and it's a topic which might become alive, and if it does, it'll be a Brew Ship special, and I will make sure to have a nice gentleman called the Foo with me, because that would be sensible. It would be sensible to have the Fleet of Oceans. Probably sensible to try and ask Drac and see if he's free on a Sunday as well to join it to discuss this one, because this is Canals Never. And honestly, this is going to be a discussion of what might have been if these canals didn't happen. But you have to remember, these canals are in many ways a cumulative work. Putting in these canals took a major commitment of finances, a major commitment of time, effort, national organisation, a lot of risk, and a lot of luck that the geology played ball. Honestly, that we had the technology and the geology was about the right level that we could actually accomplish it. And there are canals and there are histories of things where we haven't been able to. It's scary. It is scary to think it through. We do also have up here the November Patreon videos. There is going to be Leslie's, which won with 15 votes. What if Japan pulls out of China in August 1941 and Yonai gets back in power? August 1941 is an interesting thing, and if Yonai gets back in power, Admiral Yonai, Prime Minister Yonai, who knows what happens. For them to happen, that's going to be an interesting discussion, and there's going to be a few other things. But yes, this is an alternate history, which is a theme currently with the videos getting through and the Patreon votes. Interesting one. It comes in waves. You get a lot of alternate history getting through, and then you get a lot of other history questions coming through. At the moment we're getting a lot of alternate history coming through, but we've also got Michael 66, World War I in the English Channel, What Happened? Which will be an interesting little video to put it together. That's supposed to be a premiere as well as Carl Hanshaw's Italy stays neutral in World War II. If Japan moves against Britain in the Pacific, how does the war go? Ooh. Well, the thing is, if the Mediterranean fleet's not being used for the Mediterranean job, then those ships and those losses in the Mediterranean and the commitment of German forces to the Mediterranean never happened. North Africa campaign doesn't happen. And these are relatively minor ripples compared to what's today's discussion. Today's discussion is Canals Never. How could either the Kiel, Suez or Panama Canal not being built affect world events? Well, let's consider the canals themselves are a world event, and, well, you get into a bit of a sticky situation here, because if the Suez Canal isn't constructed between 1859 and 1869, would there be the financial case for the Panama Canal? You see, we can argue the strategic case for the Panama Canal. That's easy. It's good for the US Navy to be able to join up. That makes sense. That is a useful function. That's a core function. But it's unlikely anyone's going to fund building a canal for 82 kilometers across the mountains and all the terrain and jungle terrain of Panama so that the US Navy's life is made easier. The US Congress are not so sensible, nor are they so providing of funding. Plus, then you have to secure it, and it's in a foreign country to begin with. They're more likely to try and build a canal across Texas and California than they are to try and do that. And that would be several hundred miles. I don't think that's any more logistically feasible, but, extend the Rio Grande, perhaps, to perform a ship canal across northern Mexico and America. Oh, God, oh, goodness gracious me, the amount of combat that would lead to. America securing both sides of the canal. Oh. Anyway, leaving that to one side. If you don't have the Suez Canal, it's very hard to see how you have the Panama Canal. Kiel Canal Now that's different. The Kiel Canal could come about whatever case, because in many ways the Kiel Canal is an extension of existing canal systems, and it's a logical thing. Economically, it is reducing to an extent. It's linking up canal networks in a way. Yeah, the Kiel Canal is kind of interesting. There's a reason it has to be worked on between 1907 and 1914 to make it wide enough for the ships of the next generation to go down. Because when it was built, it wasn't really designed for larger ships to get through, which tells you all you need to know about it. It's to do with coastal trade. It's to do with stopping that coastal trade having to go around Denmark. It's to providing direct access for the Baltic trade to the ports of Antwerp and to extent the ports of London. This is an economic thing, but the ship movement and large ships are not really part of the thought process in this period. So how are we going to go about this? What we're going to do is we're going to sit there and we're going to discuss what the likelihood or reasons why one of these wouldn't get completed, and then what its likely impact on the world events, in my opinion. And I'm going to tell you now, today's question is quite simple. It's going to be, what do you think happens? If you want to, put comments down below. Have a nice little sort of title of the Suez, and then what you think would happen to the world, and Kiel and Panama. One of the interesting things to point out and to consider is, if you don't have the Suez Canal, does the Royal Navy end up having to be stronger to hold on to India? To secure Britain's place in the Far East? Without the Suez Canal, this is going to be something we're going to think through. Because, but also, what happens to a lot of the Mediterranean nations? Think about their economic capabilities. Now, in the Mediterranean, they sit astride a major sea route because of the Suez Canal, a major sea line, which connects them in with all the world's economy and all the movement of the world's goods, which gives them a tremendous trade and economic advantage, which has an impact to this day. You have no Suez Canal. And Panama Canal's fairly obvious, but let's be honest, if you're talking about trade, if you have the Suez Canal but you don't have the Panama Canal, then that means the cross-Pacific trade is going to go down even further. Which means that's going to affect the development of the west coast of the United States. Because as important as the west coast of the United States is going to be, if to trade with it you either have to go around Africa, around South America, or around Asia, you're not going to, are you? The ports are going to matter are going to be East Coast ports, because most of the trade, especially while it's developing, is going to be coming from Europe. And if you're a big trading ship, and if you consider modern trading ships on the way they go apply their world's trade by going from port to port, kind of like a bus with container ships, well, why would they go over there? Why would the really biggest ones go over there? Because they can go all through the Indian Ocean, stop off in India, Africa, and go Europe, and then go across to America and then back, and that's going to be a far more profitable trade route, because you can make so many stops and so many. It's just pickups and deliveries. It's just sensible. So, realistically, there has to be an end time. If we're talking about this, there has to be an end limit. And I'm going to set that around about the time period for about World War I. 1920. Let's go with it. Now, let's go after World War I. Let's say, actually, no. Let's go after the time of the Washington Naval Treaty, so about 1925. I keep moving it back over about a decade, but I think we can reasonably do up to 1925. I think much beyond there gets problematic, because you have aircraft and you have all sorts of other things entering place, and that becomes far more difficult to estimate how that's going to affect things. Do you agree? They will notice you've moved from your sleeping spot to next to me, and that's because sausages have arrived. So Poodle has moved from being asleep, well, he's been for most of the day, in front of the door to being next to me and adoring. No, you're not getting sausages. You're gorgeous, but no sausage. No sausage for you. You get bickies, not sausages. So, with that said, shameless book plug. Now, shameless book plug. This evening, if I've recorded this correctly, you'll already seen a little bit of an announcement about this evening. So I don't need to say that. Thank you for that again, but I do say thank you for that nomination again. Thank you for your kindness and support of the channel. It means a lot. Thank you for those who bought or are considering buying this book for Christmas. I highly recommend it for loved ones who are interested in history, or especially naval history. It's a really good book if they don't have it already. If they do have it, there's both a paperback and a hardback edition, and there's no rule, I've checked, that you can't have both. And, you know, thank you, because I'm an academic. In the UK, you don't get hired unless your published books are doing well. But also thank you to everyone who's been supporting the channel, who's been helping me with getting the stuff together in this office, putting together the calyxes, all those things. Thank you. Moving house and pneumonia, they're not a good mix. Moving house and pneumonia, and when you planned and budgeted for you to do a lot of the work yourself, really not sensible. I literally have to eat this food, otherwise I perish. I'm supposed to take a certain amount of calories in per day. You would eat all of it, wouldn't you? Without any qualms. Not happening. Poodles. Everyone thinks because they're poodles they are these soft dogs who don't eat anything. He's going to go off and sulk, isn't he? He is. Have some water mournfully. But thank you for that. Thank you for the support. Thank you for your kindness. And thank you for being so helpful. It's very kind of you, and without you, this channel wouldn't be where it is. Without you, this channel would not have grown to where it is. And thank you to everyone who's liked, shared, and subscribed. Thank you to everyone who watches the videos the whole way through. Thank you to everyone who does whatever level of support you do, including watching the videos, because that matters. That does matter. I do watch the time and go, how many people what's the average time people spent watching this video? Because that matters to me almost more than the number of people for some reason. Although I am still supposed to get to 15,000 subscribers by Christmas to end the bet between my mother and her twin sister. We'll leave that to one side. So, let's start off by discussing, before we get into it, world trade and the realities of world trade. Because I think there are some things I need to lay down before we start really getting into the discussion of the canals. So what do we have to consider about world trade? Well, there is the fact that world trade is not immutable. You do not have a divine right to it. One of the reasons why cities and most of the early settlements seem to form around rivers is because rivers tend to make for good bases of trade routes. They allow you to move goods relatively easily in volumes which make the trade, the risk of moving the goods, worthwhile doing. Because you can move in a sufficient volume to make sufficient profit to make it a viable enterprise. Now, what does this mean if we're talking about the loss of any of these major routes? Well, any of these canals go, this is going to have a massive effect on world trade. I already pointed out the Mediterranean. If you consider all the trade routes which are going through the Mediterranean, imagine all that trade now having to decide to go maybe around Cape Horn, around Africa, back to the UK, back to Europe, from the Far East, from India. It's no longer going through the Middle East. It's no longer going through the Red Sea. It won't go anywhere near there. You can see trade routes on this map which are being shown, which are the routes which are used if the ships aren't going to the canal. So those routes give us a good idea as to what the routes would be if there was no canal there. Because the same rules of efficiency apply. Same rules of necessity apply. You're probably not going to have everyone charging straight from Singapore towards Madagascar and straight to the Cape. Why? Because honestly, that's a good way to A, unless you've got the latest, greatest navigation gear, get into trouble, and radios and all those systems, and B, it means you can't stop somewhere else and get something fixed or sell some goods and pick some more up. And you have to remember, whilst we'd like to believe that container shipping has created this new thing of where the ships hop from port to port, carrying offloading some, then carrying on, that's not new. That's exactly what tramp steamers used to do, which was the huge bulk of the British mercantile fleet. That was what Britain had such an advantage of, and so was so useful in World War One, in World War Two for the convoys, because tramp steamers were able to carry pretty much everything. They could be adapted to carry whatever you wanted. As long as it was goods that could be loaded into their holds, they could take it. And you could adapt those holds fairly quickly because they were designed with the idea of that in mind. So, world trade. And if we think about it again, pretty much the loss of these canals doesn't affect the rise to preeminence of certain powers, but it's going to affect how they evolve. Some of them rose to prominence a long time before the canals came about, before the canals were even a feature. For America, the Panama Canal is a strategic issue, not an economic issue, really. And at this point, most of the trade going around, well, what can I say? That doesn't really happen that much in terms of volume of goods. It's railways and roads have always been the cross-America more common thing since they've come into availability because of ease of access and because, believe it or not, there is a lot in the center of America for those railways and roads to go through, for the spaces for them to be a profitable journey. Maybe not as profitable as on the coast, but there is plenty there to make the journey worthwhile doing. And whilst there is some goods which does go around, before Sal Merculano comes on here and goes, some does, and tells me off, which he can do, there is some, but the volume is mostly oceanic cross trade. And coastal trade, not necessarily going through the Panama Canal trade. Mainly because to go through the Panama Canal costs money. So it has to be worthwhile, which means you're talking about goods which have to be both big enough to be worthwhile sending by ship. In volume, it's worthwhile sending by ship, and that will generate sufficient profit. It's worthwhile sending them through the Panama Canal, which will cost money. Yeah, see the problem? What stack up against that trade? So about the Suez Canal, what impact does this have? Without the Kiel Canal, what impact does this have economically? Well, that's something we have to consider about, because it's not just going to be about the navies and the forces which are built, it's going to be the economics of the situation. This is the world's economics in 1930. Well, 1930s. As spotted by the British, looking at where the merchant vessels over a certain size are operating. Please note, this accounts for about, I think it's about a third to a fifth, depending on sources, of the British merchant fleet were considered large enough to be accounted for on this table. There are many, many more ships out there than are measured on this table. But let's be honest, what are those smaller ships probably doing in terms of routes? Well, the smaller tramp steamers are probably going around the various ports of Africa and South America. They're probably collecting goods into those major feeder ports, into the entrepôts that act as the core ports from which goods are moved out from around the world, the hubs and spokes. you'll find a lot of them plying the trade around India. You'll find a lot of them plying the trade around Australia, around Southeast Asia and China. The SS Vincent de Paul of the Tsingtao incident in January 1939 is a good example of such vessels. So yes, there is a lot of trade going on in the spaces, even though where you don't see the ships going. But it's not the volume of the big ships. It's not the volume of the big ships. So that considered, let's think about the Suez. The Suez Canal is this vital link. It cuts off having to go round Africa. Let's think about it again. It cuts off having to go around Africa. But it makes going through the Mediterranean therefore vitally important. Because suddenly the Mediterranean becomes this prime trading route. Because of the fact it serves as a link route, as well as having all the goods and all the people along it itself, it serves as a link route between major centres of the world. So not only is it a centre of the world itself, it's on a link route between major centres of the world. So you've got Italy there, you've got all sorts of different economies along and through the Mediterranean, which both provide a reason for trade to go through there, but also have been incredibly advantaged. Well, having had incredible advantage given to them by the fact that the trade is flowing past them anyway. The fact that goods are going past them. The fact they're so interconnected into the world's trade network. And it also gives them strategic power. Now, if you don't have the Suez Canal, it makes having a Far Eastern empire a lot more expensive. It really does. It means you're going to need far more forces out there because you cannot rapidly deploy forces. It also probably means that, in the British case, the Mediterranean fleet ceases to exist quite early on. There will probably still be a Mediterranean squadron because of its importance to the world and the British interests, but it won't be a fleet. In fact, in the nicest way, under a no Suez Canal scenario, I do not see the British having anything less than an Atlantic fleet and an Indian Ocean fleet. And they will have to set up two completely naval centres of support. The whole decision and discussions as to whether or not Bombay was going to get expanded into a full naval base akin to Plymouth and Portsmouth and all the facilities there, that suddenly doesn't become a discussion point. But there again, you're probably not investing in Malta, you're certainly not investing in Alexandria. To the same extent, Gibraltar is still of value because it allows you to seal off the Mediterranean, which allows you to seal off half the French Navy, and the Italians if they become problematic, and everyone else in the Mediterranean if they become problematic. So Gibraltar is still important. Gibraltar is still useful. The rest really doesn't matter much. Interestingly enough, perhaps, and this is a potential, the British may actually give Malta back to the Knights of St. John after, sort of century or so later, or something, or not much longer after Napoleon leaves there. Because let's be honest, the British will have only had it for roughly Malta for roughly a century, where by the time the canal was built. And by that point, if the canal hadn't been finished, they would have probably hadn't been completed, or actually hadn't been able to be done, they would probably not have bothered. And if we have to consider the reasons why a canal wouldn't be built, because frankly, it is so economically obvious and useful that the only reasons it wouldn't be completed is if there was a massive mountain range there, which would mean no one could go through it. And no way you could get through it in that time period, or pretty much any time period, if the mountains were steep enough and tough enough. It would just be cost prohibitive to the extreme. Or it was controlled by a military power which was run by a nation which was absolutely moribund and stupid. So pretty much you have to consider it for the Suez Canal not to be built because it is such an economically important route, an essential route for so many nations involved, especially Egypt. For it not to be done, there has to be a really good reason. So there has to be basically a mountain range there. Which does change a few things, I suppose. It gives you a mountain range in the middle of that region, which would probably have some effect on what happened in the world events, but we'll leave that to one side. Without the Suez Canal there, the Mediterranean loses a lot of its importance. But conversely, South Africa, that grows massively important. That suddenly becomes an absolutely critical, crucial colony, a crucial port. It's going to be the critical access point and critical position to control that trade. Because let's be honest, which would you prefer to go as a merchant steamer trying to make money? Do you want to go across the Pacific, round South America, and across the Atlantic? Because I can guarantee you, if this isn't built, there is no way anyone's getting the funding for the Panama Canal. If this can't be built, this is the test case that proves it. That proves all these canals worthwhile. It's one of the earliest. It's definitely the biggest, one of the biggest, longest. But it's also, it's the most economically the most successful. It's the one they're all trying to be like, in financial terms. You've seen it. If you want proof, you've seen it on the news. When there were ships blocking this canal, the world suffered actual serious economic damage. There were actual companies, actual organizations which went bankrupt. Others suffered major financial losses. There was a whole debate within some insurance companies as to whether or not it constituted an act of God it caused so much harm. Unfortunately, they couldn't claim it did. It was very much human-made. Dang the humans. So, that's the reality on that one. And economically, therefore, you are going to see a lot more development of ports around Africa. You're going earlier on, because those ports are going to be major stopping points for trade. And if you've got major trade stopping points, because the ships need to stop there to refuel and coal, because let's be honest, coaling stations are how quite a lot of big ports got their, in the world got their start, then you're going to see some industrial development going on there. You're going to see some economic movement going there. Probably more railways built to funnel goods to those ports so they can sell stuff from there. It could be interestingly economically on Africa. It could be. Now, I've already discussed the fact that the British probably don't have a Mediterranean fleet and would have to develop an Indian Ocean fleet. In terms of the big consequences, Panama Canal probably doesn't get built, as I said. Kiel Canal probably still does. There are other natural confluences which lead to the Kiel Canal getting created. And interestingly enough, that could then kickstart some interest in developing other canals. Could. It's unlikely, because it's going to be considered to happen through rather a very flat area in a civilized part of the world where there was lots of resources, and it was very easy. It was therefore considered relatively easy to do. You can hear people talking themselves out of it now if you listen carefully. So once you go from that, what happens? Well, presuming that countries carry on doing what countries are carrying on doing prior to the period of this coming into, so 1859, you're going to see a very interesting world develop. Because in order to sustain the British Empire is either going to have to choose to crumble, which, to be honest, it was never happy choosing to do. Let's be honest, it's the only empire in the world which successfully tried to choose to find a way to become a friendship organization post that. That's not the type of thing it's going to do. So it's going to invest in infrastructure, and that's something it was doing anyway up until pretty much the end of World War One. It was heavily investing in infrastructure around the world to support fleets and to support bases. This is something it's going to have to do to maintain itself. I think without the Panama Canal, and without the Suez Canal, I'm very unlikely to see any naval treaties coming in. The reason is, if you've got a situation where you cannot combine fleets for both the two major powers, the British Empire and America, in the post-World War One era, where they have basically got to maintain separate fleets for their respective points of the empire, the British keeping one in the Atlantic, one in the Indian Ocean, the Americans one in the Atlantic, one in the Pacific. You can't afford to have a treaty system which starts limiting ships as the way the treaty system does. You either end up with a system where, frankly, the treaties aren't worth the paper they're written on because they're so loosely defined, or you end up with a treaty system which just doesn't exist. I think also probably what you see is ships having to grow bigger more quickly, as a real strategic advantage is going to be sought, especially by the British, but also by the French for their Eastern Empire and other nations with empires around the world, for ships to be able to move rapidly from one area to another, and with the distance so greatly increased as to include going around Africa instead of hopping through the Mediterranean, Suez Canal and Indian Ocean, you're going to want those ships to be able to carry more fuel. And you're going to want them to be able to transit at higher speeds to cover the distance more quickly. You might have to remember, this doesn't save just money, it saves time. It saves the only thing really of value in any part of human life. Time. The most essential thing you can have, and that's what this is. This is a time-saving device. Therefore, it saves, by which it saves labor, it saves cost, it saves all sorts of things. Fuel, the lot. So you have this out, you have maximized all sorts of things you need to do. So ships are going to have to be bigger, they're going to have more devoted to fuel supplies. That's going to affect designs. They're going to want to be pushing for speed, higher speed, more endurance. It's going to be really interesting to see how it affects ship engine design and ship structuring. Ultimately, you're probably going to have a race for size. If you consider whenever these canals have been closed down for extended periods of time, that's when we have seen merchant marines push for bigger and bigger ships, and usually that has a consequential impact on warship design as well. You might not notice it, it can be subtle in warship design, but as the merchant ships get bigger and bigger, the warships aren't often that far behind. Sometimes they're even in front, because of the technologies being developed to support them. It's like if you're developing new levels of naval architecture and marine engineering, well, that's to build a bigger hull for a merchant vessel, that same information can go into building a bigger destroyer or cruiser or battleship. It can do. So basically the big thing you're going to see is a growth in size of ships and probably no treaty. But as said, the economic map of the world, that's going to look pretty much different as well. Then we have the Kiel Canal, probably economically for the world the least significant of these three options, which feels strange to say because it is quite a very busy canal. But honestly, adding on the route going around Denmark, etc., it's not going to be that economically disastrous or that economically negative. There were plenty of trade routes before it. It basically means that Denmark and Norway and Sweden retain quite a lot of, how do I put this, power over the Baltic trade. Now, I could see this resulting in one or two things. I could see Germany trying to permanently annex Denmark as part of its growth period. I could see that certainly being a possibility. Because, let's be honest, one of the other reasons for the Kiel Canal is it's very useful for allowing their fleet to be able to operate both in the Baltic and the North Sea without having to go around Denmark to get into the North Sea. If you have to go through the Skagerrak and other very nice little routes through to the North Sea from the Baltic, that's a squeeze. But also, that's kind of a weakness because you can't secure it and it's technically neutral territory. So technically, the Danish could say no go. So the Kiel Canal matters from that perspective. So it's important to the Baltic economically, to allowing them to grow and get more. Well, no, how should they get easier access to those major ports, as said, Antwerp and London at this point in this period. But realistically, I have to say, economically, not the biggest impact. It's going to be strategically. Because, again, if we consider the Anglo-German naval race, if the German fleet is divided in two by Denmark, and they can't easily move ships between the two areas without having to go around Denmark, then they present far less of a problem. Because that means you either have the High Seas Fleet or the Baltic Fleet. The Germans have to invest in two fleets. Suddenly that makes their life a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult. Now, I could carry on more of this, but honestly, the Kiel Canal really, when I was looking at it, comparing it to the Suez Canal and comparing it to the Panama Canal, which comes next, I was going, well, there is always the argument that if you don't have the Kiel Canal, you don't have World War One, because you don't have the German fleet able to combine and able to maneuver easily, so it's going to change the entire tensions in the Anglo-German naval race, which means the British probably don't go and join the Entente, because they're able to build their force and know that their fleet will just have to deal with half the German fleet and then the other half, or they'll be fighting off the coast of Denmark, where the two fleets are trying to combine, and in which case they'll be there in superior numbers. And they might find a way to manage the sort of intelligence, etc., to be there waiting for them. But that's going to be quite a long shot for the British. So you can still get World War One, and you can still get the Anglo-German naval race taking place. It's just the Germans are going to be at an even bigger disadvantage. And I mean a tremendously large disadvantage. The one interesting thing for this was that my thoughts immediately went to, if the British know, if the Kiel Canal doesn't exist, and they know therefore the German High Seas Fleet, whenever it's going to combine, is going to have to go through those international waters. It's going to have to go through that particular area of the straits around Denmark. They'd invest in some more submarines earlier on. They already had quite a large submarine fleet by World War One. This is one of the things often forgotten about the British. The British talk about submarines as being ungentlemanly warfare, and then at the same time as they're saying that with their face, they're buying a load of submarines with their hands. They're going, "This is terrible. We are really against submarines. We'd like to buy another dozen." It's sort of terrible. We'd like, submarines are atrocious. The whole time. In this case, that would be open. There would be so many submarines, because, yeah, if you could keep enough submarine patrol there, you could make any fleet maneuvers going through there very painful in the World War I period. Very painful. And it would have, again, long-term impacts. And again, when I was looking at this largely flat area, it's a very easy economic sell. It's a very sensible thing to do. Again, the only way you could really stop it, only way you could really make it not happen, is if there was a mountain range there. In which case, Denmark might not be able to be successfully invaded, because let's be honest, mountain ranges don't tend to make for good invasion routes. And they usually are quite easy to secure, as a rule. There tends to be a lot of high ground, and it tends to be vicious fights, and people, if they are in strongly enough and easily and built positions with some well-built supply routes, you can have small units holding positions against divisions forever, infinitum, with enough machine guns and artillery pieces. Yeah. So maybe Denmark doesn't get swallowed up by Germany, but that is the other option. If it lands like this, but they don't build a Kiel Canal for some reason, yeah, I could see that being as justification in several German commanders' minds for taking Denmark, and that can play out with a lot of interesting history. But ultimately, it doesn't really change the same problem for the Germans in that they are economically having to go round. Their fleets are having to go out. Other than potentially they end up with setting up their major naval base being Copenhagen. Instead of Wilhelmshaven, they end up setting up a major naval base Copenhagen, because then they can have their fleet can operate in both the Baltic and the North Sea, and they can combine it. I think under those circumstances, I have a feeling that Sweden and Norway might be slightly differently inclined towards the Germans if Denmark's taken. I also have a feeling that could also potentially start a problem with the British, because the British have Copenhagen the Dutch and Copenhagen the Danish. I mean, a couple of times when the Danish have tried to close the Baltic, they might not be so keen on the Germans controlling Denmark. So it's an interesting thing. Thesis on would it start, or it could either lead to no Anglo-German air race, or it could lead to an entente earlier and a World War One, or a large war earlier, taking place earlier to defend Denmark from German invasion. It's a random piece of history to think about, a random alternate history, because again, as I said, this route is very important. Kiel Canal is very important in a very small area, but it's very important in that area. Without it, there are lots of issues which come up for different factors, and they're niggling issues which can be taken one way or another way. A country might decide to ignore it and not bother it. A country might decide to go to war over it. It's going to depend on the leadership at the time. Just the way the cookie crumbles on that one. And that brings us to the Panama Canal. Now, this one was... oh, frigate, this is bad. And again, it was bad because of what it forces longer term, but good in some ways. It's bad because it's either going to leave America in an absolutely worse strategic state come World War II, or it's going to leave them in a far better state, because you're going to have had the two Ocean Navy Act or something similar to it a lot earlier. We're talking Teddy Roosevelt time. You're building up a fleet? Great. We have no Panama Canal. We're not even building a Panama Canal. Oh, there's not even a prospect of building a Panama Canal. And let's be honest, the Panama Canal in many ways should not have been built. It is through a jungle, mountain range, and all sorts of annoying things. It is, frankly, an atrocious prospect to build. No one in their right mind builds it, but they did. Why? A, there was the economic basis of the Suez Canal, which suggested it was going to be an absolute rip-roaring financial success. And B, let's be honest, the US government wanted it because it would mean that they would only have to they could cut the number of ships they needed to build for their navy, and still have a large enough navy to defend themselves. But realistically, no Panama Canal. Either their Atlantic fleet is completely unable to supply anything when Pearl Harbor happens, because if they do, there's no defenses for the Atlantic side, or they have no ships in Pearl Harbor. One of the interesting questions you come across in this scenario is, if you have no Panama Canal and America is forced to play far more defensively when it comes to their territories, do they take the Philippines? Do they do that in the war against Spain? Well, they did it before the Panama Canal existed, so you must presume they would do. But the thing is, the mindset which leads to them doing that against Spain is the same mindset which leads to the Panama Canal being created. And because it's created against so many physical obstacles, it's almost a mindset you need to change for it not to happen, rather than the geography. I can't imagine how much harder you'd have to make the geography to actually make them stop. But as said, if the Suez Canal doesn't exist, there's a good reason, but we've already discussed that one. So if the Panama Canal doesn't get built, America has a real problem in its hands strategically. And that's going to affect it. It's going to force it to have to develop hubs on both coasts earlier. It's going to force it to have to develop decent links between those hubs earlier. I was not joking when I suggested there would have to be a canal network built through the United States. The United States has extensive inland waterways. They have extensive other canals built around them. And there is the famously important one, which is the reason why New York actually became New York, rather than losing out to other cities, in terms of being the major port and the major capability on the eastern seaboard. So the thing is, America's not new to canals. So they either have to build some sort of canal network across America itself. Again, that's fun to think about. There are these things called the Rockies. They would probably get in the way a bit. Or they're going to have to invest in those railways even more. Or alternatively, they are just going to have to build everything dual coasted. Everything. Whatever you put on one coast is going to have to be mirrored on the other. Which is going to be incredibly expensive. Getting Congress to do that would be a beautiful act of I don't know how. This is one of those scenarios where actually Tillman battleships might actually make sense. Because you need to be building, if you don't want to build numbers of battleships, you've got to build the biggest, scariest thing you can build to act as a deterrent. But the trouble is, then that's going to mean other powers are going to be building their equivalent of that. And it might not be Tillman-sized, because they might not need it to be Tillman-sized, or want it to be Tillman-sized. It might be Tillman-sized, because you don't want to really get into an infrastructure construction challenge with the other powers. Although I'm sure they would do their own version of it. I'm sure they would build their own equivalents to their own infrastructure improvements. It would just be different what they would do. They might well do their own Tillman size equivalents. They might not. They might go for different options. It would be an interesting thing to see. But honestly, that's one of the problems you have to deal with when you're looking at the Panama Canal. You have to think about America basically being a two-navy nation. They would have the same problem as modern Russia does, as the Soviet Union did. That, for all intents and purposes, they might have one organization, but it functions as two separate navies. Because none of the infrastructure they have can help the other one. Not realistically. And any of the forces they have to help the other one, well, they're a long way away. And by the time they arrive, they're going to require quite a lot of work to get them back in condition to carry on again. And if you want proof of that, you only have to look at the way the fleet's appearance, the Great White Fleet's appearance, turning up on the west coast of America, the impact that had on the Americans when their fleet arrived. And also the amount of work the fleet had that had to be put into that fleet to get it there in fine condition. That was a major hurdle going around South America. Interestingly enough, what you could see develop is almost as I said, not just a two-fleet system. You could see that as two sets of designs, where you have the designs of ships for the East Coast Fleet and designs of ships for the West Coast Fleet. They might actually be different designs of ships. One design optimized for the Atlantic, one design optimized for the Pacific. It could be really easy to tell differences. They could have completely different paint schemes. They would probably have very different cultures in their officers. You probably would, to try and keep the Navy working together, you would have to have officers and NCOs regularly transferring between the fleets, but it also might not be liked. You only have to consider the fact that there is still a traditional view within the rivalry between the fleets of the US anyway, because there always is within these organizations. But in this circumstances, that can get pretty extreme. Now, I would say again, as said with the Suez Canal system, the treaties, I don't see happening under this scenario, because it's too restricting for the Americans. There might be Americans who want a naval treaty, but anything they would want to agree to that would give them the security and safety they need, Britain and the other powers would not want to sign up to. Especially if Britain has the Suez Canal, and, well, under that scenario, the Americans would be going, well, you can concentrate your full fleet against us, so we need the equivalent of your full fleet on the Atlantic coast. So what, you want two full fleets like that? Yeah, then Britain was going to want the same size fleet. Or America has the same size fleet as Britain and ends up with a fleet which is, how do I put this politely, possibly smaller than Japan's in the Pacific. And definitely smaller than the British one could be in the Atlantic if it wanted. In which case, would it pass the Senate? Would they agree to it? It's funny to think about canals being a key thing for making international relations work. But they are. Just like economics, they make work. In the case of the Panama Canal and economics, what does it make work? It makes a lot of the World War II expansions and a lot of the movements of goods and a rapid movement of goods, especially from eastern ports to Pacific areas of operations, viable. It means you can load it on a ship. You don't have to load it on a train, load it from the train, or load it onto a ship, and you move it that way, as much. You still have to do it to an extent, but yeah, it's not the same. Economic impact of the Panama Canal? Well, again, we go back to this. The Panama Canal is important to a certain spectrum of trade. It really is. Especially trade coming from Europe to the west coast of the United States. But I see that trade pretty much just concentrated on going into the east coast. And just it being moved to trains to go across America. So economic impact, probably again it's going to just boost railways in the United States, mostly. But I'd be very interested to hear what you all say to this. This is not going to be a long video. This is definitely probably not going to make the hour mark, but it's an interesting topic. And as said at the beginning, my questions are quite simply going to be, what do you think happens? It's too big to say. Let me put it this way. These are too radical changes to really go hard and fast into what world events are going to cause, because it's going to change things dramatically. As said, the only reasonable way I see there not being a Suez Canal built is if there is a mountain range there, and a big one, i.e. something probably larger and nastier than what you've got in Panama. because it is such an important trade route to this day, and it cuts so much off such an important trade route. Because if you consider the entire Clipper race, the entire origins of those ships was to make that route as viable and as quick as possible to get goods from Asia to Europe and back again. That was the whole reason for the Clippers. Because that route was so valuable. That's the reason the Suez Canal exists. Because the route was so valuable, it was worthwhile spending all that money. So you don't have that. That's a big thing. And as I said, I think one of the likely consequences of that is if you don't have a Suez Canal, then it's hard to see how you justify on any grounds other than American strategic security attempting to build the Panama Canal. And that means the entire bill is going to have to be footed by Congress with the idea they're going to get virtually no money back on it other than security. And I just don't think you're going to be able to get enough of them on side to make that sale, because they don't like spending money. They don't like spending money when it's in their interest, let alone when it's obviously in their interests. But, as said, I'll be very interested to hear what you all say and you all think. So, as you all probably know if you've been watching this channel, I am currently the fundraising, all the funds coming in is going towards working for the bookshelves. And this evening, the reason I've not been live in the chat and I've not been chatting away, despite this being a premiere, is because I'm at a fancy dinner. And I was going to do I did do a recorded bit in my tuxedo, and then I changed into a shirt for an earlier version of this. But I didn't want to add that on to this video, because I changed some things, and I included some things in the introduction when I did a re-recording, because that video decided to go wrong. And I've packed up my tuxedo nicely, so I didn't want to take that out. So I'm sorry I'm not doing that bit again. But I did do a tuxedo reveal in Brew Ships. I think it was it Brew Ships, or was it Thursday nights, last Thursday's live? I think it was last Thursday's live. I did a tuxedo reveal, and it's a nice tuxedo. It really is. And thank you again for nominating me for this award. As I said, I'm doubtful I'll get it, but I'm very thankful for being nominated. It's going to be a very fun dinner, and it's going to be nice meeting the shipshape crew, and it's going to be a trip up to London, where hopefully I won't spend so much money on. I won't be so tempted to spend money on books that I end up needing even more bookshelves in here. I have maxed out the bookshelves already. I've got in here. They're all maxed out. And I haven't fully unloaded all the books. I've unloaded all the ones from my office, though, which is an advantage. Thank you for that. And what have we got coming up next week? We had Soviet Naval Aviation this week. We have Charles de Gaulle next Tuesday. And then we have French and other nations, World War II carrier naval aviation doctrine, pre-war to war. And the interesting point is that I've put French and other nations, because I've listed all the carrier powers out. France is last of the carrier powers. But there are other powers who are considering carriers, and they do have doctrines. So I'm going to look at them. Or rather, they have some proto-doctrines, which are worthwhile examining. And alongside the French doctrine, which only ever really got one carrier during that period, which was the Burns. So they really didn't get much chance to demonstrate their doctrine. But they did have some interesting ideas. It's worthwhile doing. Thank you very much for watching, and hope you enjoyed. Take care.